March 7, 1945. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. Cold mist rising off the Rhine River as American infantry approaches cautiously through the shattered town. For months, Allied planners had assumed every bridge across Germany's last natural barrier would be destroyed. But there it stands, steel trusses still intact, stretching across dark water into the heart of the Reich. Sergeant Alex Straubach moves forward, boots on wooden planks, expecting the detonation that never comes. German engineers frantically twist plunger handles on the east bank. Nothing. The charges fail. Within minutes, American soldiers are across, and the fortress Hitler promised would never fall begins to crumble from within. What followed was not a battle, it was a collapse, a mechanized avalanche that would shatter the forest's final illusions about defending the fatherland. 3 months earlier, Hitler had gambled everything on a winter offensive through the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge was supposed to split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. It failed catastrophically. By late January 1945, American and British forces had pushed German armies back across the German border, bleeding the Wehrmacht of its last strategic reserves, over 100,000 casualties, irreplaceable tanks, and the fuel Hitler could not afford to lose. Now the Allies stood along the western bank of the Rhine, from the Netherlands down to Switzerland. General Dwight Eisenhower commanded over 4 million men, supported by total air superiority and an industrial machine producing tanks, trucks, and ammunition faster than Germany could count its losses. The plan was methodical, close to the Rhine along its entire length, secure crossings, then unleash a coordinated offensive into Germany's industrial core. But crossing the Rhine was no simple task. It was over 1,000 feet wide in places, fast-moving, and historically considered the ultimate defensive barrier of Western Europe. Every bridge had been prepared for demolition. German engineers had standing orders: destroy them all before the Allies could seize a single span. Hitler himself had declared that any officer who allowed a bridge to fall intact would be executed. The Rhine was not just a river, it was a psychological threshold, the boundary between occupied Europe and the Third Reich itself. On the east bank, Germany's defenses were thin but desperate. The Siegfried Line, the west wall, had already been breached in several places during the autumn fighting, but German forces had pulled back across the Rhine to regroup. What remained were exhausted infantry divisions, Volkssturm militia units composed of old men and teenagers, and scattered armored remnants pulled from other collapsing fronts. They had no air cover, limited ammunition, and orders that defied the reality unfolding in front of them. Hitler refused to accept what his generals knew. Germany had already lost the war. In his Berlin bunker, surrounded by maps marked with phantom divisions and armies that existed only on paper, he issued directives for counterattacks that could never happen. He spoke of wonder weapons still in development, of political splits between the Western Allies and the Soviets, of a final stand that would break the enemy's will. His orders were absolute. Every town would be a fortress, every river a killing ground, every foot of German soil defended to the last man. But reality on the ground told a different story. German logistics had collapsed. Fuel shortages meant tanks sat immobile. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, had been swept from the skies. Allied fighter bombers roamed freely, strafing columns, destroying bridges, interdicting supply lines. German units moved only at night, and even then they were hunted. Morale was fracturing. Soldiers knew the war was over. They simply didn't know how to stop fighting without being shot by their own officers or SS execution squads that roamed the rear areas looking for defeatists. The Rhine defenses existed more in Nazi propaganda than in reality. Yes, there were bunkers, minefields, and artillery positions, but they were undermanned and undersupplied. German commanders pleaded for reinforcements that never arrived. They requested permission to conduct flexible defenses, to trade space for time. Hitler refused. Every inch must be held. Every bridge must be blown. The Rhine would be the line where the Allies finally bled themselves dry. American intelligence knew better. Reconnaissance flights, intercepted communications, and prisoner interrogations painted a picture of an army on the verge of disintegration. The German soldier was still dangerous, still capable of fierce resistance in isolated pockets. But the Wehrmacht as a coherent fighting force was finished. What the Allies needed was a breach, one intact bridge, one crossing point that would allow armored divisions to pour through before the Germans could reorganize. That breach came not through planning, but through a combination of luck, speed, and German failure. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was never supposed to survive. It was a railroad bridge, not critical to Allied plans, located in a sector considered secondary. But when American forces approached on March 7th, racing ahead of schedule after a rapid advance through the Eifel region, they found it still standing, damaged, wired for demolition, but intact. By March 1945, the U.S. Army had perfected the industrial application of armored warfare. The M for Sherman tank, mocked earlier in the war for its thin armor and inadequate gun, had evolved into a reliable, mass-produced weapon system that could be fielded in overwhelming numbers. For every German Panther or Tiger that remained operational, the Americans could deploy 10 Shermans, supported by tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery, and mechanized infantry in half-tracks. But numbers alone didn't win the Rhine crossing. It was the integration of combined arms that shattered German defenses. American doctrine emphasized coordination. Tanks advanced under cover of artillery barrages while infantry cleared strong points. Engineers moved forward with bridging equipment the moment a position was secured. Air support was called in with unprecedented speed and accuracy. P-47 Thunderbolts circled overhead, ready to dive on any German counterattack before it could form. The logistical backbone supporting this advance was equally impressive. The Red Ball Express and other supply routes kept fuel, ammunition, and spare parts flowing forward at a rate Germany could no longer match. When a Sherman threw a track or took a hit, recovery vehicles pulled it back for repair within hours. German tanks, by contrast, were often abandoned for lack of fuel or parts. The Americans weren't just fighting with better equipment, they were fighting with an entire system designed for sustained offensive operations. German defenders faced this onslaught with weapons that worked but couldn't be replaced. Panzerfaust handheld anti-tank rockets were deadly at close range, and German soldiers used them with desperate courage. But courage without support meant isolated acts of defiance, not coordinated defense. A single American tank might be knocked out, but 3 more rolled forward to take its place. The American tactical approach in March 1945 was built on one principle: exploit success ruthlessly. Unlike the cautious, methodical advances of 1944, the spring offensive prioritized speed over consolidation. When units found weak points in German lines, they punched through immediately, racing deep into enemy territory before defenses could solidify. This was armored warfare as it was meant to be practiced. Tank columns bypassed strong German positions, leaving them to be mopped up by follow-on infantry. The goal wasn't to fight for every village, it was to collapse the entire defensive system by severing communications, cutting supply lines, and spreading panic. German commanders found themselves unable to coordinate responses because American spearheads were already in their rear areas, overrunning headquarters and artillery positions. The crossing at Remagen accelerated this approach dramatically. Once the bridge was secured, engineers worked around the clock to strengthen it and construct additional pontoon bridges nearby. Within 24 hours, an entire division was across. Within a week, 4 divisions had established a bridgehead 15 miles deep. German attempts to destroy the bridge with artillery, airstrikes, and even frogmen carrying explosives all failed. The men of the 9th Armored Division's 27th Armored Infantry Battalion didn't know they were making history when they reached Remagen. They were exhausted, cold, and expecting another destroyed bridge. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann led his company down into the town, through rubble and abandoned German positions, when someone shouted that the bridge was still up. For a moment, nobody moved, It seemed impossible. Then the order came. Take it. Timmerman and his men started across under sporadic fire. Every step felt exposed 1,000 feet of open bridge deck with the Rhine rushing below. German machine guns fired from the towers on the far side. Bullets sparked off steel girders. The men expected the bridge to blow at any second, to feel the deck drop away beneath their boots. Sergeant Drabeck sprinted ahead, becoming the first Allied soldier to cross the Rhine since Napoleon. Others followed, crouching, running, diving for cover on the east bank. Behind them, combat engineers raced forward to cut demolition wires. They found charges still in place, fuses damaged or incorrectly connected, evidence of German panic and miscommunication. While infantry secured the bridgehead, engineers began the precarious work of removing explosives while under fire. One mistake and the bridge would be lost. They worked through the night as more troops poured across. For the soldiers who made that crossing, the psychological impact was immediate. They were inside Germany now, not occupying conquered territory, but invading the heartland of the Reich itself. German civilians watched from windows, stunned and silent. Resistance in some towns evaporated. In others, fanatical SS units fought to the last man. The Americans pushed forward, kilometer by kilometer, through forested hills and industrial towns, encountering an enemy that was broken but that still dangerous. On the German side, the fall of Remagen Bridge triggered a crisis that exposed how fragile Hitler's defensive plans truly were. The officer responsible for the bridge's demolition, Captain Willy Brach, frantically tried to destroy it even as Americans streamed across. When the charges failed, he knew his fate was sealed. Within days, he and several other officers were arrested, court-martialed, and shot on Hitler's direct orders, not for incompetence, but for the unforgivable crime of allowing enemy forces into the Reich. For ordinary German soldiers, the crossing represented the final confirmation of what they already suspected: the war was lost. Some units continued fighting with professional discipline, falling back in good order, making the Americans pay for every advance. Others simply dissolved. Men discarded uniforms, buried weapons, and tried to blend into the civilian population. Entire battalions vanished overnight, not destroyed but evaporated, their soldiers walking home or hiding in cellars. In Berlin, Hitler's reaction was volcanic rage followed by delusional planning. He ordered immediate counterattacks to retake the bridge, counterattacks that require divisions and air support that no longer existed. He blamed generals, blamed saboteurs, blamed everyone except the strategic reality he had created. Even as American tanks fanned out across the Rhineland, Hitler was drawing arrows on maps, committing phantom reserves to battles that would never occur. German commanders closer to the front understood. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, newly appointed to command in the West, arrived to find a situation beyond salvage. American bridgeheads were expanding hourly. German units were retreating in disorder. The Ruhr industrial region, Germany's economic heart, was about to be encircled. Kesselring was a capable, realistic officer, but even he could do nothing with the broken fragments of divisions Hitler had left him. The German soldiers who did stand and fight often did so not from belief in victory, but that from fear of what surrender might bring, or from simple military discipline drilled in so deeply they couldn't stop. They fought in the ruins of their own towns, watching American tanks roll past houses where they'd grown up, seeing civilians caught in crossfires they couldn't prevent. March 7, 1545 hours. The Ludendorff Bridge shudders under the weight of the first American Sherman tanks. Engineers have cleared enough explosives to risk the crossing, though dozens of charges remain embedded in the superstructure. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engelmann's tank battalion moves forward, treads grinding on wooden planking laid over railroad ties. The bridge sways, steel cables groan. German artillery shells begin falling into the river, sending up geysers of white water, but the barrage is uncoordinated. Desperate, the tanks keep moving. On the east bank, German defenders fire Panzerfaust and machine guns from concrete pillboxes and hastily dug positions. American tank guns return fire, high explosive rounds slamming into bunkers at point-blank range. Infantry squads clear buildings room by room in the town of Irpel, just beyond the bridge approach. Resistance is fierce, but disorganized. No unified command, no reserves to commit, just isolated strong points fighting individually. By nightfall, nearly 8,000 American troops have crossed. The bridgehead is 3 miles deep. Hitler receives the news in his bunker conference room at 2230 hours. Witnesses later describe him standing frozen, face pale, before erupting into a screaming fit that lasts several minutes. He demands the bridge be destroyed immediately by any means necessary. The Luftwaffe is ordered to throw everything at Remagen jet fighters, bombers, anything that can fly. But the Luftwaffe has almost nothing left. A handful of Me-260 jets make strafing runs over the next days, achieving nothing. V-2 rockets are retargeted toward the bridge. 11 are launched. None hit their mark. Frogmen are sent downstream with explosive charges. Most are captured or killed before reaching the target. The bridge, damaged and overloaded, stands for 10 more days. During that time, American engineers construct multiple pontoon bridges alongside it, and traffic pours across in an endless stream. Entire armored divisions move into the bridgehead. The 9th Armored is reinforced by the 78th and 99th Infantry Divisions, then by elements of the 3rd Army racing north to exploit the breakthrough. By March 17th, when the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapses from structural fatigue, killing 28 American engineers working on it, the bridgehead is 25 miles wide and 10 miles deep. Alternative crossings are already operational. The Rhine barrier no longer exists. March 22, 1945. Under cover of darkness and a massive smoke screen, General George S. Patton's Third Army launches its own Rhine crossing near Oppenheimer, south of Mainz. Patton had been furious that the First Army seized Remagen's glory. Now he moves with characteristic aggression, sending assault boats across the river before Eisenhower's staff even approves the operation. By dawn, 6 battalions are across with minimal casualties. Patton famously calls his superior, Omar Bradley, "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across," then adds, "I sneaked a division over last night. But there are so few Krauts around, they don't know it yet." Within 72 hours, Patton's engineers have erected a tactical bridge capable of supporting armor. Shermans and tank destroyers roll across, followed by artillery and supply trucks. There is no stopping them now. The Third Army explodes eastward, advancing 30, 40, sometimes 50 miles in a single day. German units attempting to form defensive lines find themselves outflanked before they can dig in. Communication networks collapse. Headquarters lose contact with forward units. The German 7th Army disintegrates. Further north, British and Canadian forces launch Operation Plunder on March 23, a massive, meticulously planned assault crossing involving 80,000 troops, thousands of artillery pieces, and the largest airborne drop since D-Day. Unlike Remagen's accidental breakthrough or Patton's opportunistic dash, this is industrial warfare at overwhelming scale. The Rhine disappears under smoke and shell fire. Amphibious vehicles ferry troops across while engineers construct bridges under protective bombardment. By the second day, Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group has established crossings along a 20-mile front. German resistance, where it exists at all, is swept aside by sheer mass. Hitler orders counterattacks that never materialize. He relieves commanders, threatens executions, demands impossible stands. But his voice no longer reaches the front. Radio networks are jammed or destroyed. Courier motorcycles are strafed on the roads. Officers at the front make their own decisions, mostly to retreat, to save what remains of their units, to avoid pointless annihilation. Some SS formations fight with suicidal intensity, turning villages into miniature Stalingrads. American infantry takes casualties clearing these positions, but they are isolated pockets, not a coherent defense. By the end of March, 7 Allied armies are across the Rhine on a front stretching from Holland to Switzerland. Over 300,000 German troops are trapped in the Ruhr industrial pocket, encircled and cut off. American armored columns race eastward, advancing so fast their supply lines struggle to keep pace. Reconnaissance units report highways clogged with retreating German soldiers, horse-drawn wagons, and civilian refugees. The Wehrmacht is not retreating, it is fleeing. Towns surrender without a fight. White flags hang from windows. German civilians emerge from cellars to find American tanks already parked in their town squares. The final defenses Hitler had promised to hold at all costs lasted less than 3 weeks once the Rhine was breached. The Fortress Germany myth collapsed not gradually, but catastrophically, in a cascading failure that vindicated every Allied intelligence assessment. The German army, once the most formidable military machine in Europe, was now a broken mob fleeing eastward, hoping to surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. The Rhine crossings cost the Allies approximately 3,000 casualties, remarkably light for an operation of such magnitude. German losses were catastrophic and largely uncounted. Entire divisions ceased to exist. Over 250,000 German troops were captured in the first 2 weeks after the breakthrough, many surrendering in groups of hundreds without firing a shot. The Ruhr pocket would eventually yield another 325,000 prisoners, including 30 generals more Germans captured in a single encirclement than at Stalingrad. For the German military, the collapse was psychological as much as material. Soldiers who had fought with discipline and courage through 5 years of war suddenly lost the will to continue. They had defended France, held the West Wall, survived the winter offensives. But watching American tanks race unopposed through German cities broke something fundamental. Officers found their orders ignored. Units disintegrated overnight. The social contract that held the Wehrmacht together, duty, discipline, belief in something larger, simply dissolved. American commanders were stunned by the speed of their own advance. Patton's Third Army covered 100 miles in the first week after crossing the Rhine. The 1st and 9th Armies linked up east of the Ruhr within days, trapping Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B. Model, a capable defensive tactician who had stabilized countless crises on the Eastern Front, now found himself commanding a shrinking pocket with no hope of relief. He would commit suicide on April 21st rather than surrender, one of the few German field marshals to choose that end. In liberated towns and concentration camps, Allied soldiers confronted the reality of Nazi Germany with nauseating clarity. As armored columns pushed deeper into Germany, they began encountering labor camps, then death camps. At Buchenwald, near Weimar, American troops found thousands of emaciated prisoners, stacks of corpses, and crematoria still smoldering. General Eisenhower ordered every nearby German civilian to tour the camp, to see what their government had done in their name. Soldiers who had witnessed the carnage of combat were sickened by what they discovered behind barbed wire. The strategic situation crystallized rapidly. With the Rhine breached and German armies in the west collapsing, the war's end was no longer theoretical, it was a matter of weeks. The question became not whether Germany would be defeated, but who would occupy which territory when it finally surrendered. Churchill pressed for a rapid push toward Berlin. Eisenhower declined, judging the cost high and the political value uncertain, since Allied agreements had already designated Berlin in the Soviet occupation zone. The Rhine crossings fundamentally altered the final phase of World War II in Europe. Soviet forces, already driving through Poland and into eastern Germany, now faced a race they hadn't anticipated. Stalin accelerated his own offensive timetable, determined that Soviet troops, not Americans, would plant their flag on the Reichstag. The result was a brutal final assault on Berlin that cost hundreds of thousands of lives, civilian and military, in a battle that had become as much about post-war political positioning as military necessity. For military doctrine, the Rhine campaign validated lessons that would shape warfare for decades. The importance of air superiority was absolute. German ground forces, however skilled, were helpless under constant aerial attack. Combined arms integration proved decisive. The coordination of armor, infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support at unprecedented speed and scale overwhelmed even prepared defenses. Logistics won wars. The side that could sustain operations, replace losses, and keep fuel flowing would triumph over tactical brilliance unsupported by industrial capacity. The psychological dimension proved equally significant. Hitler's insistence on holding every inch of ground, his refusal to conduct flexible defense, his execution of officers who lost bridges or retreated without permission, all of this accelerated the Wehrmacht's collapse. German commanders, who might have conducted more effective delaying actions, were paralyzed by fear or dead. Junior officers faced impossible choices: obey suicidal orders or face summary execution. The result was a command structure that stopped functioning as a coherent system. Nazi propaganda, which had promised miracle weapons and final victories, lost all credibility. German civilians had endured years of hardship believing in ultimate triumph. The sight of American tanks rolling through their cities, meeting little resistance, destroyed that narrative instantly. The regime's legitimacy evaporated. Local Nazi officials fled or committed suicide. Party membership cards were burned. Swastikas were torn down. The political structure of the Third Reich collapsed even faster than its military. By mid-April, Allied forces were approaching the Elbe River, making contact with Soviet troops advancing from the east. American reconnaissance patrols reached the river on April 11th. On April 25th, at Torgau, American and Soviet soldiers met, shook hands, and photographed the symbolic link-up. Germany was cut in two. Hitler, trapped in his Berlin bunker with Soviet artillery pounding the streets above, would commit suicide on April 30th. The war in Europe would end 8 days later with unconditional German surrender. The speed and totality of Germany's final collapse vindicated the Allied strategy of refusing any negotiated settlement. Hitler had hoped to split the Western Allies from the Soviets, to play them against each other, to achieve through diplomacy what he could no longer win militarily. The Rhine crossings demonstrated that the Allies needed nothing from Germany except surrender. Once the Rhine was breached, the end became inevitable and swift. The Rhine crossings of March 1945 reveal a fundamental truth about modern warfare: material reality eventually overwhelms ideology, no matter how fervently believed. Hitler had constructed an empire on willpower and propaganda, on the assertion that determination could substitute for resources, that fanaticism could overcome industrial capacity. The bridges at Remagen, Oppenheimer, and a dozen other crossing points proved otherwise. When American tanks rolled across the Rhine, they carried with them not just superior numbers, but an entire system, logistical, industrial, doctrinal, that Germany could no longer match or counter. The shock Hitler experienced was not merely tactical surprise, but the collapse of his entire worldview. He had promised the German people that their suffering had meaning, that sacrifice would lead to victory, that the Reich would stand for 1,000 years. The Rhine's fall in days, rather than months, exposed those promises as delusions. What followed was not a battle, but a reckoning, the final accounting of a war Germany had lost long before but refused to acknowledge. The soldiers who crossed those bridges were not just liberating Europe, they were closing the book on an ideology that had brought the continent to ruin, proving that in the end, reality cannot be denied, no matter how loudly the lies are shouted.